The fun and the magic of Summit is we have deeply technical, highly analytic presentations and experts and presentations, and then we shift from the deeply technical to the deeply human. So our next speaker is Allison McDonald. She's a Ph.D. candidate in electrical engineering and computer science, otherwise is fondly known around here as EECS. And she's going to be discussing keeping a low profile, technology, risk, and privacy among undocumented immigrants. So a highly interdisciplinary, deeply human, deeply important subject. Allison, please welcome to the stage.
Hello. So, like Self said, I'm a PhD candidate in the computer science department. The work that I'm talking about today, I did with colleagues in the School of Information. So today I'm talking a little bit about technology and undocumented immigrants. Before we get too far into the weeds of that, I wanted to tell a story. So this is Anna Maria. She and her husband immigrated to the United States about 12 years ago from Mexico. They desperately wanted to have kids, but were having trouble conceiving. So they came to the US to get the fertility treatment that they needed. So now, today, they have 2 kids. Both of them are in public school. Both Anna Maria and her husband are working, paying taxes. They're active in their local church and just living pretty normal lives. And really, the one difference between Anna Maria and many of us is that Anna Maria is undocumented. What this means specifically for her is that she entered the United States on a tourist visa and then stayed past the date it was valid. What that might mean for others like her is that they physically crossed the southern border. But essentially what that means is that she's in the United States without legal authorization and has to worry every day about the life that she's built here being taken away from her, being detained and possibly deported back to Mexico. It's worth noting that Anna Maria is far from alone. There are as many as 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States today. And this is a really large community that's constantly having to worry about being removed from the lives that they've built here. So I want to first talk a little bit about what that fear might look like. In the United States, we have the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE for short. ICE is under the Department of Homeland Security. It's an organization that's basically empowered to detain and deport people who are in the United States without authorization. They've been gaining a lot of, they're a fairly new organization, but they've been gaining a lot of power and resources in the last 2 decades, and increasingly so in the last 2 years since the Trump administration took over. There's another reason that I am especially interested in this moment as a technologist, and that's that immigration enforcement is becoming high-tech. You can see in this photo, someone's getting their fingerprints taken. More and more frequently, we're hearing stories of people having their biometric data collected, even if they're not necessarily being detained themselves. We're having stories of immigration enforcement coming into communities and stopping one person but taking the fingerprint data of everyone in the area, or going into someone's house and detaining one person but collecting data about everyone who's there. We're also hearing stories about use of devices like this. This is a cell site simulator, also sometimes known as a Stingray. It essentially acts as a fake cell tower. So if you're near the device when it's active, your phone might connect to that rather than the real cell tower. That allows whoever's operating it to collect the phone numbers and data about the people who are nearby. So DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, is the umbrella organization over ICE. And a Freedom of Information request last year revealed that they're using devices like this over 1,800 times in the last year. We don't really have any information about how they're using these devices, but every once in a while, a single story will come out. This is actually a story that is quite close to here. This was something that happened in Detroit, Michigan. Immigration enforcement got a warrant for this man's phone number from Facebook. They were able to get his phone number from Facebook and then use a cell site simulator to sort of troll around where they thought he might live to locate him. They ended up deporting him back to El Salvador. We're also hearing more and more about how immigration enforcement is soliciting requests for new technologies to do digital vetting of immigrants, both immigrants who are crossing the border and who may already be here. And in particular, they're looking for contractors to build social media mining tools. We're hearing stories about social media handles being collected at the border as people enter the country. This story actually just broke earlier this week, that Amazon, who's building this facial recognition technology called Recognition, has been in discussions with ICE to sell that technology to immigration for purposes that we can only speculate about at this point. But this is scary for a lot of reasons. For one, the technology is not that good yet. It's actually the same tool that was recently highlighted by the ACLU when they did an experiment putting a bunch of congresspersons' photos into the database and getting out that a large number of them apparently had a criminal record they didn't know about. It's also concerning because the more and more we deploy tools like this, tools that are omnipotent and sort of everywhere, the more we have to worry about people being afraid to be out in public or to access services and resources that they otherwise might have a right to access because they're worried about being seen by cameras, not just people. And this is a frightening moment for another reason, and that's that this administration has made it abundantly clear how they feel about immigration. Even within the first year of the Trump administration, we saw the end of the DACA program, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, that basically deferred immigration cases for those who had entered the country under the age of 16 and allowed them to work and go to school in the US. We're seeing the erosion of privacy protections and the increasing sharing of data between federal agencies and between local and state and federal agencies, meaning that there's more centralization of data that's at the disposal of immigration enforcement. Just this past summer, we saw the separation of children and parents at the border, disregarding the public outcry against that kind of thing. So the administration has been pretty clear about how they feel about this issue. And so putting tools like recognition, like facial surveillance, and the ability to mine social media data is especially scary at this point in time, to put that kind of technology into the hands of those who are enforcing these laws. This is also not just something that we're hearing about on the national level. People are feeling this in their communities. The other thing that's changing is that the prioritization of immigration cases is changing. The Obama administration did deport quite a few people, but they tended to focus on those with criminal records or who were national security threats, whatever that might mean. Whereas now we're seeing more and more people who don't have criminal records, who have been in the United States for a long time, who have US-born children being targeted where they otherwise would have been low-priority cases. There are stories of folks who have been known to immigration enforcement for years, who have been going to regular check-ins every 6 months to just show that they're still here and they're still doing everything they need to do to stay in the good graces of the immigration enforcement. And now they're being detained at these check-ins, even though they're doing everything they're being asked to. So this is really creating a lot of fear in communities. It's not just talk, it's really action as well. So what does this all mean for Anna Maria? For one, without a criminal record and having been in the United States for more than 10 years, she previously wouldn't have been a high priority case, but now she's not so sure. She's seeing people in her community being deported, even though they're in similar cases to where she is. She's having to think about what she might do about her kids if she and her husband are deported. Do they transfer custody to friends and family who can stay in the United States so that they're able to get the US education that they want? Or do they take them back to Mexico? They're having to worry about being in their apartment complex because it's an area where a lot of immigrant families live, and now she's worried that if immigration enforcement comes for one of those families, she and her husband might also have their biometric data collected, even though they're not being stopped for any specific reason. So it's really this context that spurred the research group I work with to talk to this community. So specifically, what we wanted to study was, how is this community using technology? How are they integrating it into their lives? And while they're doing this, what risks are they seeing in using these tools? And finally, how are they reacting to those risks? How are they protecting themselves online? By looking at this, we're hoping to get a better insight into how people are able to protect their privacy when the need and the risk is so great. If the consequences are as extreme as they could possibly be, are people really able to protect themselves better than maybe the average person? In order to do this, we conducted interviews. We started out by working with immigrant rights organizations. They essentially helped us connect with this community safely and made sure that we were talking to people in a way that was safe for them and that was sensitive to their needs and concerns. We ended up being able to talk to 17 undocumented immigrants in the Midwest. The average age of our participant was about 35. Most of them were parents with young kids, and so a lot of the concerns that they had also revolved around keeping their families safe. Everyone we spoke to had been in the United States for more than 10 years, so this is a really settled population. This means that the fears and concerns for people might be a little bit different if they were a newer group of immigrants, but everyone that we talked to had really a settled life here and was really concerned about being able to maintain it. Most of the people we talked to were from Mexico, which is pretty typical of the US immigrant population from Central America, or Latin America. And we also had a mix of immigration stories. Some of the people we talked to physically crossed the southern border and had fairly traumatic stories about coming to the US, and some had just overstayed visas. So to figure out sort of what risk and fear of immigration looks like in their daily lives, we just wanted to talk to them a bit about how they manage this risk without technology first. Across the board, what we found is that immigration enforcement is really a looming presence in people's lives. They think really critically about how they're exposing themselves to authority figures, what information they're exposing, and how they can best keep a really low profile. A good example of this is the decision not to drive. So it's difficult to get a valid driver's license if you don't have the immigration papers. So most of the people we talked to, everyone we spoke to didn't have a driver's license. And the decision to drive or not to drive was something that everybody, over half of the participants we talked to, brought up as a concern. One of our participants talked about just deciding not to think about it, trying to stay as calm as possible, knowing that there was risk, but just needing to do what they needed to do to get their job done. Especially in the Midwest, where public transportation is not always great. The decision not to drive was a really big sacrifice that some of our participants were willing to make. This one talked about fearing that if if she drove, she would be detained, and so it was better just not to drive at all. Which might mean that if her kid missed the bus in the morning, they couldn't go to school, or that she couldn't set her own work schedule because she was bound to the bus schedule. Most of the people we talked to also were filing taxes, which means that once a year they submitted paperwork that had their names and their addresses and their phone numbers to a federal agency. And so the decision to do this was one that people thought a lot about as being the potential for a positive impact. This woman talked about if the day came where she had the opportunity to get a legal status, having this history of filing taxes might be something that worked in her favor. And so the decision to give that information up to a US federal agency was worth the risk. We also talked to one family about the decision to file for DACA for their son. So DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, would give the son who would have come to the US under the age of 16 the ability to have a driver's license, and essentially would have given an assurance that he wouldn't have been deported as long as he was going to school and working in good standing with the US government. But their concern was that even though the program said that the information they filed was confidential, they had to give up their own names and their own addresses and phone numbers in order to file this paperwork, and they just didn't trust that that would be safe for them. This family decided not to file this paperwork, and unfortunately, only a month or two after we spoke to this person, the DACA program was repealed. And now the people who have filed that paperwork are in a position of having to worry without any assurances that that information won't be used in the future for immigration cases. There's also a change in the way that people are feeling this concern. Lots of the people we talked to described feeling like immigration enforcement was becoming less predictable and more aggressive. This person described feeling that immigration would come to their neighborhood and they weren't really looking for anyone in particular, but just looking for somebody to take. And we heard people talking about changing their lifestyles to account for this new fear. This family talked about how now in the mornings they take their daughter with them, whereas they would have let her sleep in while they dropped their other child off at school. Now they're worried about being separated even for a couple of hours in the morning because they don't know if immigration enforcement might come to their home, or they're worried about being separated if they're stopped while they're out. So we're finding that people are really taking a lot of precautions offline. So we wanted to ask them, how are you using technology and how is this integrating into your life? Everyone we spoke to had stories to tell us about how indispensable this technology has been for them. Everyone we talked to had a smartphone and relied heavily on it to communicate with their family abroad and with their community here, but also to organize their own work schedules, and probably in the way that many of us use our smartphones religiously. It's really something that they have found has benefited their lives extensively. Most of the users or the participants we talked to were on Facebook, all but one. But they also talked about WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat. Really, they tended to use all the same tools that many of us use. There was very little use of anything that was outside of the most common tools and social media platforms. We can see from this example how much the ability to use social media platforms has changed people's lives. This person describes having to previously spend a lot of money, no matter the time of day, on international calling cards to be able to keep in touch with family back in their origin country who they can't see anymore. It's worth noting that lots of the people we spoke to haven't seen their family from their their origin countries since they left, because they're not able to leave the US and then come back. They're not sure that they'd be able to get back into the country. So many of them have to rely on these tools to maintain those relationships. We wanted to ask them, though, specifically about what concerns they had when they used these tools. And to be honest, most people had concerns that were pretty typical or mundane even. They worried about fraud and identity theft, and especially the parents worried about strangers being able to talk to their kids online. So the concerns they had that they were quickest to name and the most sure about were really things that many of us worry about online, nothing that really related to their status, their immigration status. But some people did talk about having to worry about harassment in particular, especially when talking about immigration online, participating in conversations on news sites or on social media. There's this concern that if they are too vocal, there might be consequences. They have friends and family who have been threatened online. This person had a friend threatened with immigration because of something they had said in a news article. The concerns that were more related to their immigration status were a lot more uncertain. For example, we had people sort of wondering, rather than stating that they were concerned, they wondered whether they should be worried about the fact that their phone number and their name are in their friends' phones. So if someone is detained, should they really worry that their phone number is in the contacts list of their friend's phone? Or that their friends are all listed in their own phone? Similarly, we had 2 participants talk about WhatsApp and how phone numbers are shared even if you don't know the person who you're in a group chat with. One of our participants was added to a group chat and noticed that the phone numbers and the names of the people in the group, even though she didn't know them, were exposed to her, and worried that her name and phone number had been shared with them as well, and immediately left it and decided not to use WhatsApp. We also had some participants thinking about whether they should even attend rallies or vigils or anything related to immigration because people are taking photos and they're not sure if they should really worry. They don't know if there's a good reason to worry about whether someone's taking a photo of them and sharing it on social media. Photos in particular, people tended to, it was a more concrete concern in some ways because they thought very carefully about what information they were sharing by sharing photos. We had a lot of participants talk about not taking photos in their home or of their children because they were worried about what information that might be sharing, even with people on Facebook, for example, which is a network they could possibly trust, a group of friends. The people who did decide to share sometimes would just delete content because they just didn't feel confident that whatever channel they were using was private enough. And we heard a lot of people deliberately choosing to share photos bilaterally. They'd share it in a chat with their family back home rather than sharing it broadly because they just weren't really sure who could see it when they would post something on Facebook, for example. When we asked people to what extent they were using privacy controls, basically everyone said not at all. They weren't going into their privacy settings and changing who could see which post, or maybe even changing per post who could see the content they were sharing so that they could more carefully curate audiences. All of the controls that people were doing for keeping information only in certain circles was abstaining from publishing things widely and sending things directly. So what I mean is that they would often opt to just not share anything at all on a public wall on Facebook, for example, and instead send information directly through Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp. And when they weren't sure about what was visible, they'd often just ask friends. So instead of checking privacy settings, if they weren't sure if something was visible, they would ask someone they knew to just check their wall. So they weren't using the tools really much at all to control privacy settings. They were thinking about sharing or not sharing, and then using their friends and family to double check that things were safe. We also overwhelmingly heard that people trusted the platforms that they were using. And in particular, none of our participants mentioned that Facebook was really, that Facebook owned the majority of the tools that they used. Actually most of our participants only talked about tools that were owned by Facebook. And no one really talked about Facebook being an entity that might have interest in their data, or even that could collect data. And certainly they didn't mention that that data could then be shared with law enforcement. There wasn't a sense that Facebook was an actor in this ecosystem as much as a conduit for their data. In addition to that, people actually had quite a positive feeling about Facebook. They were grateful that Facebook would alert them if someone was trying to get into their account, or if they lost their password, that Facebook was quick to respond. These sorts of security breaches and protections that Facebook has in place has really established a lot of trust with users. We also talked to people about whether they were finding themselves worried about sharing things. And we found this tension between self-expression and self-censorship. This woman said this really beautifully, that she has to just watch the conversation about immigration happening around her, and she feels a lot of impotence because she doesn't feel safe participating. She wants to be able to make her opinions heard, but she has too many stories from friends and family about being threatened with immigration enforcement, or having to worry about their kids being followed or being threatened. But we also had a participant talk about how it's more important to her to share her thoughts than to get legal immigration papers. And this quote in particular sort of highlights a tension sometimes that exists even in families, and certainly within the community. Many families are mixed status, which basically means that maybe the parents don't have a legal status, but the children do because they were born in the US. Or aunts and uncles or family members might have different immigration statuses. And that means that families and communities more broadly are in a position of having to navigate their own safety, but also the safety of the people that they care about, who might be at more or less risk than they are. So this person was fighting with her mother because her mother just wanted her to not post anything about immigration on social media. And she really felt like she had the right to do that, and it was more important to her to share what she was thinking than it was to stay quiet. This quote actually sort of highlights something else that's really interesting that we heard in a lot of the way that people talked about immigration enforcement, and that's that it was more of a question of when immigration was going to investigate people rather than if. And that sort of leads to the next theme that we were hearing people talk about, which is that surveillance was sort of a given. We heard a lot of participants talk about this sense that immigration enforcement knows what they need to know to detain or deport them. If they decided to do it, they would be able to. And a lot of this comes back to the fact that they're already exposing a lot of information to their public school, they're filing taxes. They just have this sense that this information is available and immigration enforcement can get it if they want it. But there's also this sense is also built in experience. This participant had a really negative experience when ICE came to her home and knew things about her family that her family had kept private. They hadn't told other people. And somehow, in a way they didn't know, somehow ICE knew where a family member was traveling and for how long, something they hadn't told anyone. So this is sort of building into this feeling that they must be able to hack into my messages. They must be able to get into my phone. I don't know how else they would be able to know these things about me. They must know everything, and they must have the power to get the information that they want to. So it's really a question of when and not if. But we also heard a fair number of our participants talking about this increasing sense of responsibility that they feel to each other, to share information, to share resources. Sometimes that means just letting each other know when there's going to be a rally or a vigil, but it also might mean making sure that their friends and family know if ICE has been spotted in the community so that they can avoid the area. And so there was this sense that there wasn't a lot they could do about immigration enforcement, but at the same time, many people were starting to help each other, and there must be some sense that there's something they can do because they're doing it. They're helping each other as much as they can. The sort of the major interesting threads here were that people were really having pretty common uses of technology. They weren't doing anything in particular to protect themselves online, but they were really aware of the amplified consequences of unintended information disclosure. And there were significant differences between the way that they managed risk offline versus online, where offline they would go through to great lengths to be less visible, and online there was some concern, but they really didn't do very much. So we wanted to ask, why does a population who is objectively at higher risk do relatively little to protect themselves online? And we had a couple of thoughts about this. For one, it can't be understated how much technology is benefiting the lives of the people we talk to. It's made a huge difference in their quality of life and their ability to live their lives as connected and as flexible as possible. The digital risks that people did think about were either really uncertain or unknown. And there was little to no connection between technology and law enforcement in people's minds. There was also a lot of trust in the platforms and in the peers that were using tools. So because Facebook had such a positive role in people's lives, they didn't tend to think very critically about what the information that Facebook's collecting could do. And finally, there is this sort of resignation to government surveillance that maybe there is something they could do, but in the end, there's this feeling that they won't have control over whether or not they're eventually detained or deported. That's something that's outside of their control. There's not much they can do about it. So as a researcher, what can we learn from this? For one, we're encouraging people to think about whether or not vulnerable communities will really adopt new tools. And this community in particular, they were using Facebook and Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. They're unlikely to move to a new platform where their friends and family aren't already. And even if they were, it's worth considering whether a specialized tool, something that, especially if it was built for the immigrant community or the undocumented community, if that wouldn't make them slightly more visible, something that might be more of an indication of their membership in that community because the only people who use it are undocumented, for example. But we do think that there's some work we can do to improve the tools that people are already using. For example, many people talked about having their phone numbers exposed in WhatsApp. So design decisions that for many of us don't make a huge difference, might be just a minor inconvenience, can have really amplified consequences in marginalized communities who are much more protective of information. So working to design tools with these communities specifically in mind can really make a big difference. We're also really excited about some of the work that's being done in information hiding. Both iOS and Android have recently come up with this tool to basically switch between a fingerprint unlock to a PIN unlock. It's kind of up in the air whether or not law enforcement can compel you to unlock a phone. And in particular, there's a difference possibly between whether you can be compelled to unlock with a fingerprint or a passcode, where a passcode might be a little bit safer, or it's less certain that you could be compelled to give it up. In this case, so what this feature does is basically if it's in your pocket, you can press the home button 5 times, and if you previously had a fingerprint unlock, it'll switch to a PIN unlock. Along that same line, we're thinking about how we can basically seamlessly build in tools in devices that people already have that allow them to hide information depending on the context, or possibly have plausible deniability if they're in a situation where they need to hide information that they otherwise want quick and easy access to. More broadly, we're really pushing for more conscientious design principles. So thinking about the marginalized communities while we're building tools. This is something that we're trying to do in our own research group, as well as talk to other technologists about. How can we help make audiences transparent? Can it be more intuitive for people who they're sharing information with when they use social media, so that they don't have to worry or be uncertain about who can see their information? How can we make platforms more accountable so that we know at the beginning how that data that we give up might be used? And how can we limit the exposure of information by default? So how can we make that WhatsApp phone number sharing opt-in rather than opt-out, even though there's no opt-out at the moment? But if we can work to build tools with vulnerable communities in mind and integrate those into a universal design, into tools that we're all using, ultimately the privacy protections that are there for those communities will benefit everyone. We also see a pretty big need for community-attuned digital education. The people we talked to really wanted to learn more about what we wanted to talk to them about, but there were relatively few Spanish language resources, especially in the Midwest, and certainly not with the specific like status-related concerns in mind that they had. So my research group has actually been conducting Spanish language security trainings and digital literacy trainings in the community that we worked with. And many of the things that we're talking about in these workshops came from the study that we did here. For example, just highlighting how companies collect data and might use that data, and encouraging people to put passcodes on their phones, just so that if they're lost or confiscated, it's a little bit harder to get into. Overall, what we were seeing is that the undocumented community goes to such great lengths to protect themselves offline, but we didn't find that they were doing as much online. This might indicate that privacy is really hard. Even for those who have a serious reason to worry about exposing information, it's not always easy or possible to protect yourself sufficiently. Information disclosures can have really amplified consequences for certain segments of the population. And if we can improve the tools that we're all using to protect those users, ultimately everyone will benefit. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
So you spoke about, ICE as the, deliberately chasing people, for example. But are there instances where ICE is themselves compromised? Someone hacked into ICE to get lists of immigrants, that sort of thing. Is that a threat that's happened?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't heard of any stories of that happening, but I also don't know that we would hear about that if it were to happen. It's certainly true that the people we spoke to have an equal amount of fear of people in the community, harassing or threatening them. So the idea of ICE being hacked and having a list of names is definitely something that's frightening. But as far as I'm aware, it hasn't happened. Yeah.
So have you talked about or asked people about basic security and privacy concerns? So if my name was Goldstein and I was living in Germany in 1932, I wouldn't go on Facebook and use that name. I'd use a German-sounding name. You said somebody put their phone number up on Facebook, which is just a really stupid idea in the first place. Putting your actual birth date online, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't know that people are thinking. There's not a lot of connection between law enforcement and Facebook in people's minds. They might have created their Facebook account. Well, I guess everyone that we spoke to has been here for more than a decade, but people might have created their Facebook account before they came here, or without really thinking that Facebook isn't the government. So people, I think those types of decisions to change their names, I think people tended to do, but that was more of a cultural thing. Yeah, and I also think Facebook in particular, there's the sense that you're only connecting with people that you're choosing to connect with. Lots of people talked about only accepting friend requests from people they knew, or people their cousin knew, or people their cousin's friend knew. It was actually they didn't seem to be very selective at all, but they thought they were. Yeah, so I think Facebook has this feeling in people's minds that it's a little bit more protected because they can, friend people or not friend people. But for the phone number thing in particular, it's really hard not to put a phone number into Facebook. They're aggressive in asking for the phone number. Yeah, sorry? Yeah, but so for example, I don't have a phone number in Facebook, and I'm prompted regularly to give it. And if you slip up once, or if there's someday a reason you need to give it to them because they'll send you a code or something, you do it once and it's over. So it's hard to opt out of those kinds of things. Yeah.
We have another question?
Hey, so you mentioned a lot around education, and it's great to see that there are efforts to targeting the population. You also mentioned that using different tools is unlikely, and part of that might be standing out from the crowd. So to me, it sounds like there's kind of a herd immunity effect, where if we just educate the population at large, there would be less to stand out from. Just curious your thoughts on that and how we might address that.
Yeah, definitely. So no one we spoke to really talked about Signal, but that's a really good example of an encrypted messaging tool that's becoming popular enough that it might not be suspicious to use. So that's actually something that we talk to people about in our digital literacy trainings and security trainings. We talk a little bit about the difference between WhatsApp and Signal, and kind of encourage people to move to Signal, because while it's still in certain contexts and certain communities might be something abnormal, more and more people are moving to that tool, so it's a little bit less weird to use encryption.
This is probably tangent to your main topic, but I was wondering about the use of genetic information and genetic databases, and was that in exploration or something you're considering exploring?
That's really interesting. That's not something we talk to people about, and it's not something that came up naturally, but yeah, we're probably approaching pretty quickly a world in which all of our genetic information is taken through a cousin or something. So that may be a concern for people. And I would think possibly even more so if there's more of a focus on this chain migration, or bringing family members through the immigration process. Possibly like mapping out families in communities might be something that is quite scary.
Thank you, Allison, very much for your time. Thanks for your presentation.